Hello, my dear friends. Imagine for a moment the world behind palace walls, a realm of towering crowns, endless silk gowns, corridors echoing with footsteps, and chambers heavy with perfumes and whispers. In this place of supreme power, where rulers decided the fate of nations, there lurked an irony almost too sharp to believe. Queens and princesses, draped in jewels and layers of fabric worth more than entire villages, often spent weeks, sometimes even months, without ever touching a drop of clean water. It may sound like a grotesque exaggeration, but to their contemporaries, it was the rhythm of daily life. Water, that universal symbol of purity, was in their eyes a danger, a thief of health, an invisible assassin. Bathing was thought to open the pores and invite sickness, so the higher one drank, the less likely she was to wash. The irony was sharp. The woman who sat upon a golden throne feared the same thing that peasants in muddy villages longed for, a simple, clean bath to take, for instance. The young French princess who would later become Queen, Marie Antoinette. Popular imagination paints her as frivolous, drowning in perfumes and powder. But beneath those layers was a deeper truth. She lived in a world where water was viewed with suspicion. At Versailles, bathing was a rare ritual, reserved for moments when the body seemed on the verge of collapse. Instead of soap and water, her body was covered with fine linen undergarments, changed daily or, at best, every few days. Each shift of linen was believed to draw out impurities, to cleanse without water. Servants describe how the queen would stand, her skin pale and cold beneath layers of fabric, while fresh linen was draped upon her. The act was performed with ceremony, as if each thread of cloth carried away invisible poisons. And she was far from alone. Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, who ruled with a will of iron and a tongue sharper than any sword, once confessed that she bathed only once a month whether I need it or not. Those around her did not question the wisdom. Physicians of the age, cloaked in authority, warned that water weakened the body, stripped away natural defenses, and so the monarchs obeyed. But imagine, my friends, the consequence of such a rule. Beneath layers of brocade and velvet, beneath corsets tightened until breath itself became a privilege, sweat gathered, odors grew, and the skin suffocated. The court may have shimmered with jewels, but behind the sparkle was the unmistakable heaviness of human reality. One lady-in-waiting to Catherine de' Medici once wrote in her private notes that after a day spent near the queen, her own clothes seemed to carry away the scent of her mistress's body, as though proximity itself was enough to stain fabric with odor. Perfumes became the saviors of the elite. Rooms were heavy with them, bodies drenched in floral waters, musk, and oils distilled from exotic spices. Visitors often remarked that to enter the royal chamber was to walk into a cloud. Perfume was not a luxury but a shield, a veil to hide the truth that water would not touch skin. For weeks at a time, the stronger the rank, the stronger the perfume. There are stories, half whispered by servants and courtiers, of gowns that carried the weight of months. Dresses were not washed but reworn, embroidered fabrics absorbing layers of sweat and dust. Imagine a bodice, tied around the chest, lined with whalebone, worn day after day. Night after night, the fabric grew stiff, carrying its own memory of the body, until even servants recoiled when handling it. Yet no one dared speak. Etiquette demanded silence. Reverence demanded obedience. One woman, a maid who served Queen Isabella of Spain, recorded in her own letters that she would sometimes sneak open the windows of the queen's chamber at night. The stench of enclosed fabric, she wrote, was enough to choke. But if the queen awoke to find the windows open, the maid risked dismissal, for night air was believed to carry death. Better to choke on the inside than risk the invisible dangers outside, even in their intimacy. Queens were prisoners of these rules. Catherine the Great of Russia, brilliant and cunning, understood power better than most men of her age. Yet even she was known to avoid regular bathing, relying instead on vinegar rubs and perfumed cloths. Her lovers and favorites whispered of her sharp mind and iron will. but rarely of the closeness of her skin. To mention such things was unthinkable, yet it lingered, unspoken, between the folds of history. And here lies the strangest paradox. The higher the crown, the deeper the fear of water. For the poor, water was life, cleansing both body and spirit when available. For the powerful, water was death, to be kept at bay with layers of linen and oceans of perfume. The queen's body became a stage, her skin the canvas upon which superstition and ritual painted their strange patterns. Yet the consequences did not vanish. Physicians recorded endless cases of sores, rashes, fevers, and infections. Courtiers whispered of unbearable odors in audiences, of handkerchiefs pressed discreetly to noses. One ambassador from Spain, after a long reception at the French court, confessed in his diary that he had nearly fainted from the heaviness of perfume, and sweat mingled in the air, a fog more suffocating than the smoke of battle. Still, the ritual endured, for to bathe was to court death, and to smell was simply the price of survival. If water was mistrusted, then clothing became the substitute, both shield and prison. The body was to be covered, layer upon layer, until skin itself became a stranger, hidden even from its owner. Queens awoke each morning not to bathe, but to be dressed, and the act of dressing was nothing less than a ritual of power. Servants entered with armfuls of linen shifts, corsets, farthingales, underskirts, overgowns, and finally the outer layers of jewels and embroidery that announced to the world who their mistress was. For a peasant, a dress was cloth. For a queen, a dress was a fortress. And like any fortress, it was rarely clean. Consider the case of Anne of Austria, Queen of France in the 17th century. Her wardrobe was a treasure trove of velvets, satins, and silks, stiff with gold thread. But these fabrics, once worn, trapped the body's sweat and oils. A corset pressed against the ribs from dawn to night, whalebone and metal biting into skin, leaving bruises that never quite faded. Servants whispered of sores that festered beneath the layers, hidden from sight, but impossible to ignore for those who undress her at night. Yet, to speak aloud of such things was unthinkable. To acknowledge the body was to risk offending the majesty of the crown. One seamstress recorded in her journal that after months of continuous use, certain gowns became so stiff with accumulated sweat and powder that they stood nearly upright. When placed against a wall, she joked grimly that the dress had become more alive than the queen herself. A second skin that carried its own odor, its own memory. The shift, that humble linen undergarment, was the only garment washed with any regularity. It was meant to absorb the body's impurities. To change the shift was, in theory, to clean oneself. But imagine the reality. Linen that clung to damp skin through summer heat, turning yellow and stiff after days of wear, pressed close by corsets that allowed no air. When the shift was finally changed, the old one carried away not only sweat, but fleas, lice, and every manner of insect that found shelter in the folds of royal fabric. There are accounts of Elizabeth of Valois, the Spanish princess who married into the French court, struggling against rashes and infestations. Her ladies noted discreetly that the queen scratched at her arms beneath the silk sleeves. Though to show irritation in public was forbidden, physicians prescribed powders of ground pearls and vinegar rubs, which soothed little but added another layer of expense to the endless charade of cleanliness. Without water, perfumes once again stepped in as saviors. Sachets of lavender, cloves, and dried roses were sewn into bodices. Gloves were soaked in oils of ambergris and jasmine, so that to kiss a queen's hand was to taste perfume rather than skin. The fashion spread downward, nobles and courtiers followed suit, until the entire court walked in clouds of competing scents. But no amount of lavender could hide the deeper truth. In the heat of summer, ballrooms became unbearable. Hundreds of bodies pressed together, dressed in layers of fabric and drenched in oils, their skin unwashed for weeks. One observer at Versailles in the early 18th century described how the air grew so heavy by midnight that candles sputtered and fainted, as if even flame could not endure the thickness of the room. And the people, oh, the people, noticed. Servants carried home the smells of the palace in their clothes. A laundress in Madrid once refused to work any longer for a royal household, confessing that no amount of scrubbing could rid the linens of their odor. It is as though the garments themselves protest against being cleansed, she wrote still. Fashion demanded extravagance. Farthingales widened skirts to impossible diameters. Panniers stretched gowns until women could barely pass through doorways. Each addition of fabric meant more weight, more heat, more sweat. Yet the queen endured, because to appear less adorned was to appear less powerful. One anecdote tells of Maria Theresa of Austria fainting during a reception, not from hunger or illness, but from the sheer weight of her clothing. Nearly 40 kilograms of silk, jewels, and steel pressing down upon her, the servants rushed forward, fearing death. But when she awoke, the queen laughed faintly and insisted the reception continue. To admit that her clothing had nearly killed her would have been weakness. And so, the ritual endured. The paradox deepened. Garments meant to display purity and majesty instead concealed filth and decay. The more splendid the dress, the more unbearable the body beneath it. And yet, those who wore them smiled, bowed, and held their heads high. For to be royal was to deny the body in order to preserve the crown. If the body was hidden beneath layers of linen and brocade, the face was the battlefield where beauty, power, and decay clashed most fiercely. For the queen's face was not her own. It was a mask, a symbol, a canvas on which the hopes of a kingdom were painted. Every blemish, every wrinkle, every shadow beneath the eyes carried political weight. To appear pale was to appear noble. To glow with color was to betray the vulgarity of labor. And so, faces were not simply adorned, they were reconstructed. Cosmetics became both a tool and a poison. The whiteness of skin was the ideal, the standard against which all women of rank were measured. Sunburnt cheeks belonged to peasants who toiled in fields. A queen's skin, by contrast, was to resemble marble, untouched, eternal, pure. To achieve this illusion, women turned to white lead powder, a deadly substance that promised beauty while delivering slow ruin. Elizabeth I of England is perhaps the most famous example. In her youth, she had been striking, with auburn hair and lively eyes. But illness left her with scars of smallpox on her face. In a world where imperfection was political weakness, she could not allow the world to see. And so she cloaked herself in layers of Venetian trews, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. Applied day after day, year after year, it smoothed her complexion into a ghostly mask. Courtiers marveled at her eternal youth, her alabaster beauty. Few dared whisper that beneath the powder, the queen's skin was eaten away, sores forming that never healed. One ambassador noted in his secret letters that when Elizabeth spoke, the powder cracked slightly around her mouth, revealing glimpses of inflamed skin beneath. She is like a statue of wax, hero, beautiful from afar, terrible up close. Yet no one dared speak such truths aloud. To mention the queen's failing flesh was to risk not only disgrace, but death. And Elizabeth was not alone. Across Europe, noble women pursued whiteness with equal desperation. Catherine de' Medici's ladies applied powder until their faces gleamed under candlelight, though some fainted during long ceremonies, overcome by the fumes. In Spain, Queen Isabella was said to spend hours each morning while her maids layered her face with a paste of churros, then covered the shine with rice powder to dull the unnatural gleam. The consequences were horrific. Lead seeped into the skin, poisoning the blood. Teeth blackened, hair thin, lips cracked. Women suffered migraines, tremors, even paralysis. But because they were queens, their suffering was renamed delicate humors or royal ailments, never acknowledged for what they truly were, slow poisoning in the name of beauty. There are darker stories too, half buried in diaries and letters. One French duchess, admired at court for her radiant pale complexion, began to lose her mind in middle age. She spoke to shadows, laughed in silence, forgot the names of her own children. Servants whispered that her beauty potions had devoured her reason. Physicians prescribed more powders, more ointments, which only deepened the torment. She died in her bed, raving, her face still powdered as though she were attending a ball. But not all cosmetics were deadly in such a direct way. Some were simply absurd. To redden the lips and cheeks, women used vermilion made from mercury, another slow poison. A smile, painted scarlet, could hide crumbling teeth. A touch of rouge could disguise exhaustion from nights spent in endless ceremony. Powdered wigs and elaborate hairstyles completed the illusion. A queen could stand in a hall reeking of sweat and perfume, and yet her face, powdered and painted, declared eternal freshness still. The mask slipped. One servant of Maria Anna of Austria wrote that after long audiences, the queen's cheeks would streak with red as sweat dissolved the rouge. The powder clumped, leaving pale rivers down her face. She resembled a painting left out in the rain, the servant confessed. Yet to touch her face, to wipe away the ruin, was forbidden. The queen stood, smiling faintly, as though nothing had happened. And then there were the beauty patches, small pieces of black silk or velvet cut into circles. Stars, or hearts, pasted onto the face. Ostensibly, they covered blemishes or sores caused by cosmetics. But soon they became fashion in their own right, a secret code of flirtation and power. A patch near the lip meant coquetry, near the eye meant passion, on the cheek meant boldness. Courtiers whispered about their meanings, lovers exchanged glances over them. Yet beneath the silk hearts and velvet stars often lurked ulcers. Raw flesh concealed by symbols of elegance, perfumed gloves, scented fans, wigs dusted with powder. All these extended the mask outward. Queens were not merely women, but living illusions, carefully painted to hide the reality of decay. One might imagine, my friends, what it was to kiss such a queen's hand, to brush lips against perfumed leather, never touching true skin, to gaze into her face and see only lead and silk, never flesh, to share her presence and yet be kept at a distance by walls of cosmetics and ritual. It was not beauty, it was theater. And like all theater, it carried a hidden cost. If the powdered face was a mask, then the mouth was the one part of the body that betrayed the illusion most cruelly. No amount of silk or velvet, no veil of perfume or layer of trews, could conceal the smell of decay when it rose from within. The breath of queens was often their most dangerous secret. To smile was to risk exposure. For behind lips painted vermilion, teeth crumbled silently. Sugar, the new treasure of empire, flowed to royal tables and rivers. To the common people it was rare and costly, but to monarchs it was served daily in sweetmeats, candied fruits, wines, and pastries. It was both a luxury and a slow poison. Elizabeth Tudor, who painted her lips with mercury-based rouge, also consumed mountains of sugar. Her courtiers adored her sharp wit, but in private they whispered of her teeth, blackened, cracked, sometimes lost entirely. One ambassador wrote home that when she laughed, he saw more shadow than pearl. The queen attempted remedies, clove oil to numb the pain, powdered coral to strengthen the gums, even the application of ground bone and vinegar. But nothing could stop the rot, and she was not unique. Catherine de Braganza, Queen of England as wife of Charles II, brought with her from Portugal a love for tea sweetened with sugar. At court, this fashion spread rapidly, but soon her teeth darkened, her gums inflamed. Courtiers, while imitating her tea-drinking habit, also shared her fate, blackened mouths hidden behind fans and handkerchiefs. A chronicler noted that kisses at court became ceremonies of perfume and cloth, lips pressed against gloves or masks rather than skin. Dentistry as we know it did not exist. Physicians prescribed strange powders, ashes of burnt bread, crushed pearls, even ground stag antlers. One French princess reportedly rubbed her teeth with powdered coal mixed with honey, a practice that left them stained and sticky. Another German duchess swore by rinsing her mouth with urine, believing it would bleach and cleanse. Servants recorded their horror at preparing such concoctions, but obedience left no choice. Breath itself became a battlefield. Perfumed pasty, small balls of herbs, musk, and resins were chewed discreetly, their fragrance intended to mask the stench of decay. Courtiers described the constant clicking of teeth on these little pellets during audiences, the faint aroma of cinnamon or clove wafting through the air. But it was never enough. One Venetian ambassador, after hours in the chamber of a Spanish queen, confessed that the perfumes clashed so violently with the rot of teeth and gums that he nearly fainted. It is as if roses are planted in a graveyard, he wrote, and yet, to speak of such things was impossible. To comment on the queen's breath was to risk disgrace or worse. Silence became the armor of courtiers, who smiled faintly and endured. Servants learned to breathe shallowly, to turn their faces slightly away when dressing or undressing their mistress. Some wrote in secret of the ordeal, describing mornings when the first words spoken by the queen filled the chamber, with a scent so heavy it lingered in their hair and clothes. The search for remedies bordered on madness. In the 17th century, Maria Anna of Spain was prescribed powdered emeralds to cure her toothache. The gems were ground at immense cost, mixed with wine, and applied to her gums. It did nothing but glitter faintly between her lips when she smiled. Another queen was given tinctures of mercury, a poison on top of poison, which dulled her pain while further rotting her body, even in death. The teeth of queens told their stories. When the body of a certain Austrian archduchess was prepared for burial, the attendants noted her gums had receded so far that her smile was a grimace. Her teeth black as coal, yet her face was powdered, her lips painted, her body dressed in satin, as though even in the tomb, the illusion had to be preserved. These were not isolated tales. Across Europe, royal households carried the same burdens, teeth sacrificed to sugar, breath masked with spices, pain dulled by absurd remedies. Physicians, bound by tradition, prescribed ever stranger cures. Some suggested inserting live frogs into the mouth to draw out the ache. Others advised binding garlic cloves to the wrist, believing pain would drain downward from the jaw. Nothing worked, but all were tried. And still, queens smiled. They spoke in councils. They whispered to lovers. They addressed their courts, all while hiding the silent rot within. Their crowns gleamed, their gowns glittered, their faces shone pale under candlelight. But their smiles, painted and perfumed, carried the echo of decay that no power could silence. For in the end, not even royalty could escape the body's rebellion. If the face betrayed the slow poison of cosmetics, and the mouth whispered of sugar's revenge, then the rest of the body told its own tragic stories of medicine that was no cure, of doctors whose tools were as dangerous as the diseases they claimed to fight. For queens, whose very flesh was the property of dynasties, illness was not private suffering. It was theater, performed before physicians, courtiers, and priests, and the stage of medicine was often more brutal than the illness itself. The cornerstone of royal healing was bloodletting. For centuries, the balance of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was thought to dictate health. Too much of one, and the body rebelled. The cure drained the excess. And so, the bodies of queens were pierced again and again, their veins opened with delicate blades or leeches placed upon their skin. Imagine Catherine de' Medici, formidable queen of France, lying in her chamber while physicians debated over the color of her complexion. Too pale, she must have an excess of phlegm. Too flushed, clearly too much blood. The cure was always the same. Leeches, writhing in bowls, were pressed to her arms, her thighs, even her temples. Servants recorded the sight with horror, the queen's skin spotted with dark circles. Where the creatures fed, her sheets stained not with perfume but with blood. And yet, she endured. To refuse treatment was unthinkable. Elizabeth of Valois, the young queen of Spain, was bled so often that courtiers feared she had no strength left to rise from her bed. Physicians insisted it was necessary, that each weakening brought her closer to balance. But balance never came. She died before her 24th birthday. Her body wasted not only by illness but by the very hands meant to heal her. Nor was bloodletting the only cruelty. Purgatives and emetics were administered in abundance. Queens drank draughts of bitter herbs, oils, and minerals, meant to cleanse the body of invisible poisons. The results were violent, hours spent vomiting or bent over in agony, bowels emptied until strength itself seemed to drain away. But to the physicians, such suffering was proof the cure was working. The poison departs, they declared, while the patient trembled on the edge of collapse. Maria Theresa of Austria, mother of 16 children and empress of half of Europe, endured endless cycles of such treatments. When she suffered headaches, she was given mercury ointments to rub upon her temples. When she weakened from childbirth, she was dosed with arsenic and wine to restore vitality. And when she complained of stomach pains, physicians prescribed repeated purges until she could scarcely stand. Her letters reveal her despair. They say it is for my health, but each cure makes me weaker than the last. Yet she submitted. For to defy the physicians was to risk being accused of disobedience to God's order. The irony was sharp. The crown offered no protection from the knife of the barber surgeon, no shield against the leech. Queens were stripped of their silks, their jewels set aside, and their bodies treated like fragile vessels, opened and drained and poisoned in the name of balance. And then there were the enemas, devices of glass, silver, or ivory, filled with broths of herbs, milk, or wine, sometimes even infused with gold dust. They were administered not in privacy but in ritual. Servants held the queen, physicians directed, courtiers sometimes waited outside, whispering. In France, enemas became so fashionable that Louis XIV himself was said to have received thousands during his lifetime, and the women of his court followed his example. To refuse was to risk appearing unfashionable, even ungrateful for the miracles of medicine. A diary from one of Maria Antoinette's ladies records an afternoon when the queen, suffering from indigestion, submitted to such a treatment. The lady described how the queen smiled faintly, masking her humiliation, while the physician announced the success of his cure. Outside, courtiers bowed as though the kingdom itself had been healed. The absurdity was almost too heavy to bear, yet it was the rhythm of life beyond such rituals. There were charms and superstitions. Queens wore amulets of gemstones against plague, rings of bezoar stones said to neutralize poison, lockets filled with dried toads or powdered mummies. Catherine the Great kept by her bedside a vial of powder ground from Egyptian mummies, believing it gave strength when mixed with wine. To modern eyes it seems grotesque, but in her time it was the wisdom of empires one cannot ignore. Either the endless baths not of water but of vinegar, milk, or wine. Since water was feared, substitutes were sought. Cleopatra was said to bathe in milk, a myth, perhaps, but one that lived in the imagination of later queens. Marie Antoinette tried baths of sweet almond milk and rose petals, believing they preserved her youth. Isabella of Spain preferred vinegar rubs, which left her skin raw but protected from plague. These rituals were less dangerous than mercury or lead, but they consumed fortunes and hours. The body treated as a temple yet never truly cleansed, the contradictions multiplied. Queens smeared their faces with lead, their gums with mercury, their bodies with vinegar and wine. They swallowed arsenic to brighten their eyes, painted their cheeks with vermilion, bled themselves pale with leeches, all in the name of health and beauty. And when they collapsed from weakness, physicians declared the treatments must continue. The servants, those silent witnesses, carried the truth in their letters. One maid wrote of carrying bowls of blood-stained cloths from her mistress's chamber, the metallic smell clinging to her hands. Another described how her queen, too weak to stand, was lifted by for women into bed after a purge. A third confessed she prayed daily that her mistress would refuse the doctors, but knew such defiance was impossible. Her crown is her prison, she wrote. She cannot say no, and perhaps that is the truest tragedy. Queens were symbols, not women. Their bodies belonged to dynasties, to kingdoms, to physicians and priests. They endured bleeding, purging, poisoning, not because it healed them, but because their suffering itself was proof of obedience to order. And so the rituals continued, generation after generation. A crown on the head, leeches on the skin, powders on the lips, poisons in the blood. Beauty and health became performances, illusions maintained until the body could endure no more. If crowns glittered above their brows, then hair, or what passed for it, was the true battlefield of appearances. For centuries, the natural hair of queens was rarely seen by any eyes but those of their closest maids. Instead, the head was a stage upon which wigs, powders, oils, and ornaments proclaimed rank, and beneath the shining curls of human hair, horsehair, or goat's wool, the reality was far less regal. Consider the towering coiffures of 18th century France. Marie Antoinette became a symbol not only of extravagance, but of invention. Her wigs could rise nearly a meter high, sculpted into ships, gardens, or whole scenes of triumph. Servants worked for hours, even days, to assemble such creations, weaving wire frames, patting with hair, dusting with flour or starch until the structure gleamed pale under candlelight. To appear in court with anything less was to risk mockery. But the grandeur had its price. These towering wigs could not be taken off and redone each day. They were worn for weeks, sometimes months, their powder falling like pale snow across pillows at night. Beneath them, the scalp festered, sweat gathered, lice thrived, and sores formed where pins pressed into flesh. Maids recorded in letters how they scratched their mistress's scalp with ivory sticks, careful not to dislodge the towering edifice above. One maid of the Duchess de Chartres confessed that the smell beneath the wig grew so unbearable. She stuffed her nostrils with lavender before beginning her work, and when the wigs were finally removed, the scene was pitiful. Matted natural hair clung damp to the skull, crawling with lice. Sometimes patches had fallen out entirely, the scalp rubbed raw by powder and pins. Queens wept in private, begging their physicians for tonics to restore their hair, only to be given concoctions of pigeon droppings, vinegar, or onion juice. None worked, but to appear bald, to reveal weakness, was unthinkable. And so the cycle continued. Wigs piled higher, powders thickened, perfumes doubled, while the real head beneath rotted in silence, even in earlier centuries. The struggle with parasites was constant. Catherine de Medici's court, glittering though it was, teemed with lice and fleas. Queens and princesses were no exception. Their gowns and wigs were warmed by body heat, their silks too thick to launder. Their beds seldom stripped. Insects thrived. One lady-in-waiting wrote of sitting beside her queen during prayers, feeling the telltale tickle of fleas moving beneath her own stockings. I dared not move, dared not scratch, she confessed, though my whole body burned. But queens had their weapons. Silver combs, fine-toothed, were passed daily through wigs and natural hair alike, scraping out lice and nits. Flea traps, small boxes lined with blood-soaked cloth, were hidden in the folds of gowns or beneath skirts, meant to lure insects away from royal flesh. Perfumes again did double duty, masking not only sweat, but the scent of vermin. Still, no trap was perfect. Diaries of chambermaids reveal how often queens woke scratching, how often blood speckled the sheets in the morning. The humiliation was real, though hidden. Isabella of Spain once raged at her servants when a flea was spotted upon her sleeve during Mass. She took it as a divine punishment, though her confessors reassured her it was merely the frailty of flesh. But for a queen, even the smallest insect became a symbol of disorder, a reminder that beneath the crown, the body remained vulnerable. And yet, even the vulnerability of the body could be turned into theater. Powdering the hair with flour became not only a way to whiten and stiffen it, but to smother lice. The air of ballrooms grew so thick with powder that guests sneezed continuously, their wigs leaving trails of white upon chairs and tapestries. One English ambassador remarked that he returned from a French reception looking as though I had marched through snow, but the queen smiled, their faces pale masks above their snowy coiffures, and none dared speak of the vermin suffocated beneath. Still, death came, and in death, The truth of the body could not be denied. The corpses of queens were not immune to the same decay they had spent their lives disguising. When Maria Theresa of Austria died, attendants described the heavy scent of her chamber, where vinegar and incense were burned to mask the odor of illness. Her body was prepared according to ritual, washed not with water but with wine and herbs, wrapped in linens, painted with powders to preserve the illusion. Yet even through the spices and balsams, the truth pressed through. A maid recorded that the stench clung to her hair for days, no matter how she scrubbed dot in France. The embalming of queens was a public act, observed by physicians and courtiers. The heart was removed and placed in a gilded urn, the entrails sealed in separate vessels. The body itself was stuffed with aromatic herbs, sewn and dressed in silks. It was, once again, theater. Death turned into ceremony, corruption hidden beneath satin. But the servants, those closest witnesses, wrote in secret of the reality. One described how the body of a queen, barely cold, already oozed from sores long hidden by powder. Another confessed she nearly fainted when ordered to powder the corpse's cheeks, the rouge blending grotesquely with the pallor of death. Sometimes nature rebelled even against ritual. In Spain, during the funeral preparations of one queen, the body swelled so violently from decay that the coffin could scarcely be closed. The priest declared it a sign of divine judgment. The servants knew better. It was the inevitable truth of flesh, long mistreated, now breaking free. And yet, even in death, illusions endured. Coffins were paraded through streets lined with incense, banners waved, bells tolled. The people saw not decay but majesty. They now crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The queen, they believed, had passed into eternity. Her body as untouchable as her crown. Only the servants, the physicians, the women who had combed her lace, powdered her sores, and held her during purges, carried the memory of her true body into silence. The story of Queen's hygiene, or the lack of it, is not simply one of disgust. It is one of contradictions. They were symbols of purity, yet their flesh rotted beneath silks. They embodied divine order, yet they scratched at fleas in the night. They were perfumed, powdered, painted, yet their teeth blackened, their breath sickened, their scalps bled. Even in death, they were painted and perfumed, their decay hidden by ritual. Perhaps this is the deepest irony of all. The crown that promised immortality could not protect against lice or rot, and the rituals of beauty and medicine, meant to preserve majesty, only hastened decay. But still, the theater endured, for a queen was never a woman alone. She was an image, a mask, a body sacrificed to the stage of history. And whether in life or in death, she played her part until the curtain fell. History often remembers queens as statues in marble or portraits in oil, serene, majestic, untouched by the ordinary frailties of flesh. But if one looks closer, beyond the silks, beyond the jewels, beyond the layers of paint and perfume, another picture emerges, one that is far less immortal and far more human. It is the picture of bodies trapped inside crowns, women consumed by rituals of beauty and medicine that were as cruel as they were magnificent. We have followed them through their days, rising not to bathe but to dress, their bodies imprisoned beneath brocade and whalebone, their skin suffocating and shifts of linen stiff with sweat. We have stood beside them as powders of lead and vermilion masked their faces, whitening skin even as it decayed beneath. We have walked with them into chambers heavy with perfume, where the air choked with the scent of roses mingled with the odor of flesh. We have heard their teeth crack beneath sugar, their gums inflamed with mercury, their breath concealed by cloves and musk. We have witnessed leeches feasting on their blood, enemas administered in gilded tubes, powders of arsenic and emeralds consumed in desperate hope. We have sat in their chambers as wigs crawled with lice, as maids scratched their scalps with sticks, as fleas hopped across their silk sleeves during mass. And we have followed them into death, when their bodies were embalmed with wine and herbs, powdered and painted for display. even as decay announced itself from beneath the satin. This is not the story of isolated incidents, nor the morbid delight of scandal. It is the truth of an age when medicine was ritual, when beauty was theater, when power demanded illusion at any cost. Queens were not permitted to be women. Their bodies were kingdoms, symbols upon which the order of the world was written. To admit weakness was to admit disorder. To reveal decay was to invite rebellion. And so, the illusion was maintained, no matter the suffering. Take again Elizabeth I. In her later years, she was rarely seen without her full mask of white lead, her hair replaced with elaborate wigs. Her teeth rotted, her body weakened by endless cures. But when she appeared before her people, she glittered still, a living emblem of England's majesty. Her courtiers bowed, her people cheered, ambassadors wrote of her undying youth. Only her maids, those silent witnesses, knew the truth, the sores hidden beneath the powder, the breath masked with cloves, the wigs hiding baldness. And yet, Elizabeth herself understood the necessity. "I will not make windows into men's souls," she once declared. Neither would she allow windows into her own flesh, or consider Marie Antoinette, whose towering wigs and perfumed gowns became the very image of extravagance. Beneath them, her scalp bled, her skin suffocated, her body was tormented by indigestion and purges. But to her subjects, she was Madame Deficit, the queen of excess, the embodiment of France's decadence. They hated her mask, but they never saw the woman trapped beneath it, the woman scratching at her scalp in the night, swallowing bitter tinctures, fainting under the weight of fabric. History condemned her not for her suffering, but for the illusion she was forced to maintain. And what of Catherine the Great? She ruled an empire with brilliance, expanding Russia's borders and reshaping its institutions. Yet in her chambers, she too endured vinegar rubs, powders of strange herbs, the crawling of lice, the suffocating perfumes of wigs and silks. She was both empress and prisoner, free to command armies, bound to the rituals of a body that could never belong to her alone. The paradox is inescapable. Queens, the most powerful women of their age, were also the most powerless when it came to their own flesh. Every choice was dictated by physicians, by fashion, by ritual, by fear. To bathe was dangerous, to wash clothing wasteful, to appear barefaced unthinkable. They bore the burden of crowns that glittered with jewels, but weighed down their bodies with suffering. And yet, perhaps this is where their true strength lay. For despite the poisons, despite the sores, despite the humiliations of medicine and the decay of the body, they endured. They rose each morning to play their roles, to stand before their courts, to embody majesty itself. They endured pain that would have broken others, because their suffering was woven into the very fabric of their duty. The servants, the maids, the physicians, they carry the secret memories. Letters hidden in archives tell of the smell of sweat beneath silks, of wigs crawling with vermin, of mouths that stank of rot, of coffins that swelled with decay. But the people, the subjects, the world, they saw only the mask. They saw only queens. What lesson remains, then, from this long, grotesque theater of hygiene? Perhaps it is this, that power, no matter how dazzling, cannot erase the truth of flesh. That crowns cannot silence the body's rebellion. That illusions, no matter how carefully painted, eventually crack. And yet, there is also another lesson, one of resilience. For if queens were prisoners of etiquette and superstition, they were also survivors of them. They bore crowns not of gold alone, but of lead, mercury, sweat, and blood. And still they ruled. Still they inspired loyalty, fear, love, and hatred. Still they stood, masked and perfumed, against the tide of history. When we look at their portraits now, when we gaze at alabaster faces framed by jewels, perhaps we should remember not only the illusion, but the reality. The lights beneath the wigs, the sores beneath the powder, the blood drained by leeches, the teeth blackened by sugar. We should remember that beneath the crown was always a woman, vulnerable, suffering, enduring. And in that memory lies their truest humanity. For the queen, in the end, was never immortal. She was flesh and bone, trapped in ritual, yet strong enough to bear it. Her true legacy is not the illusion she maintained, but the endurance with which she bore the weight of it. When the curtains fall on the theater of queens, when the perfumes fade and the powders settle into dust, what remains? Not only the memory of crowns and battles, of alliances and betrayals, but also the silent testimony of bodies, frail, suffering, enduring. The history of royal hygiene is not merely a catalogue of grotesqueries. It is a mirror held up to human fear, ambition, and illusion. For every leech pressed against a queen's skin, every wood powdered into whiteness, every jewel sewn into a gown too heavy to bear, was an act of belief. Belief that beauty could be manufactured. Belief that health could be purchased with pain. Belief that the body could be controlled, disguised, even conquered. And yet, the body always spoke. Beneath the lead, sores grew. Beneath the perfume, sweat gathered. Beneath the silks, insects thrived. Beneath the crown, decay waited. The queens were trapped in a paradox. Their power depended on denying the very flesh that made them mortal. In this sense, they were not so different from us. For do we not, even now, cloak ourselves in illusions? Do we not paint, perfume, disguise, and discipline our bodies in pursuit of an image? The products have changed: creams instead of cheroos, surgery instead of leeches, diets instead of enemas. But the logic remains. The mask must be maintained. The performance must go on. Let us walk once more through the galleries of history. There is Elizabeth I, standing proud before her court, her face a mask of white, her eyes burning with iron will. There is Marie Antoinette, her wig towering like a monument, smiling faintly as her scalp bleeds beneath. There is Catherine de' Medici, submitting to physicians who drain her blood in hope of balance. There is Maria Theresa, writing letters of despair as arsenic weakened her frame. There is Catherine the Great, brushing powder into her hair, swallowing mummy dust with wine. They are distant yet close. Their chambers smell of musk and rot. Their sheets are speckled with blood, their pillows dusted with powder. But they rise each morning, they dress, they smile, they rule, they endure. And what of those who stood beside them, the servants, the ladies in waiting, the physicians, the confessors? Their pens recorded the truth that portraits concealed. They wrote of odors that clung to fabric, of wigs crawling with lice, of coffins swelling with decay. They prayed for their mistresses, pitied them, sometimes despised them. But above all, they bore witness. Without their words, the queens would remain only marble and paint. Through them, we glimpse the woman beneath the crown. It is tempting to laugh at the absurdities: wigs shaped like ships, baths of wine, teeth brushed with coal and honey. But laughter dies quickly when one remembers the cost. For these were not eccentricities of vanity alone. They were burdens of duty. A queen's body was never her own. It belonged to dynasty, to court, to kingdom. Every powder applied, every purge endured, every jewel sewn into a gown was part of a performance demanded by power. And so we return to the central paradox. The crown gave them everything, yet denied them themselves. They commanded armies, yet could not command their own physicians. They owned palaces, yet could not open a window for fear of night air. They dined on banquets, yet starved for true health. They were adored as symbols of purity, yet their flesh bore sores and rot. What, then, is their legacy? Not the illusions alone, but the endurance. They endured the poisons of fashion and medicine, the humiliations of parasites and purges, the agony of childbirth multiplied by politics. They endured isolation, scrutiny, ridicule, and the suffocating weight of ritual. They endured, and in enduring, they ruled. This endurance is, perhaps, their truest crown. And when we, in our age of mirrors and screens, examine ourselves, the cosmetics, the surgeries, the diets, the endless pursuit of beauty, perhaps we should remember them. For the queens remind us that the mask, no matter how perfect, always cracks. That the body, no matter how disguised, always speaks. That power, no matter how divine it seems, always bends to the laws of flesh. The lesson is not despair, but clarity. To see them not as marble statues, nor as grotesque curiosities, but as women caught in a web of duty and illusion. Women who suffered and endured, who laughed and wept, who carried crowns heavier than gold. And so, when the last perfume fades and the final curtain falls, we should not remember only the wigs, the powders, the jewels. We should remember the women beneath, their pain, their resilience, their humanity, for in the end, the history of queens is not only the history of crowns. It is the history of flesh, fragile, flawed, enduring. I remember the first morning I served Her Majesty. I was barely 16. My gown still smelled of the chest where it had been stored in my mother's house, and my hands trembled as I carried the basin of wine that was to wash the queen's lips. I had imagined beauty, radiance, perhaps even holiness. Instead, I entered a chamber heavy with the mingled scents of roses and decay. The queen lay propped against pillows of crimson velvet, her skin powdered to marble whiteness, her lips painted in a scarlet so bright it seemed unnatural. Her eyes, half-lidded with fatigue, still glowed with the sharpness of command. Around her stood physicians, murmuring, and ladies arranging fabrics. The chamber was dim, for the shutters remained closed against the night air, though the morning sun already blazed outside. Candles guttered, filling the air with smoke that clung to my throat. I approached with a basin, bowing so deeply I thought I might spill it. She extended her hand, pale, thin, and trembling slightly, and I saw at once the sores along her knuckles, half hidden by rings. She dipped her fingers in the wine, touched them to her lips, and winced as though even the brief contact with liquid caused pain. Later, another maid whispered to me that her teeth were nearly gone, rotted by years of sugar paste and candied fruits. The day I also learned of the wigs. The queen wore one so tall it brushed the canopy of her bed when she sat upright. Its powder fell like snow upon the pillows. At night, it was not removed. Instead, I was assigned to scratch her scalp with an ivory stick, carefully sliding beneath the hairpiece while avoiding the pins that held it in place. The smell beneath was sour, and once I glimpsed light scurrying across her hairline. I froze in horror, but the older maid beside me gave me a sharp look. Silence was survival. We worked in silence often. The queen's chamber was a stage where suffering must never be acknowledged. Her bowels failed her frequently after the endless purges and draughts prescribed by her physicians. Yet when she groaned in pain, the courtiers beyond the doors heard only music, for musicians played to drown the sounds. We maids exchanged glances, wiping her skin with cloths soaked in vinegar, changing linens that stank of sickness. We knew, but we said nothing. Once, during Mass, a flea leapt from her gown to her cheek. I saw it clearly, though I dared not move. She flicked it away with her fan, smiling faintly, her painted lips never trembling. Later, in private, she raged. Her words were sharp, her voice filled with fury not at the flea itself, but at the humiliation of its betrayal. We spent hours afterward combing her gowns, placing flea traps of bloodied cloth within the folds. But the insects always returned. Her physicians were relentless. One week they bled her 3 times, each session leaving her so weak we had to lift her from her chair. Her arms were bandaged, her sheets spotted with blood. I remember holding the bowl, watching her life drip into it, feeling faint myself at the sight. "This will restore her balance," the physician declared, though the queen's lips trembled as she whispered prayers between clenched teeth. Another time, they gave her an enema of milk and herbs, delivered through a silver syringe. I was dismissed from the chamber, but afterward I helped carry away the cloths. The smell was unbearable. Yet when she appeared in public the next morning, she smiled as though nothing had happened. Her gown glittering with pearls, her face smooth with powder. Only we, the invisible hands, knew the truth Illness grew worse in the summer. The chamber became suffocating, windows sealed, fires burning to purify the air. Perfumes of rose, musk, and amber filled every corner. Yet beneath them lingered the stench of sweat and rot. The queen coughed often, covering her mouth with scented cloths. When she laughed, and she still laughs sometimes, though it sounded brittle, I saw her gums blackened. Her breath clouded with clove smoke from the pasties she chewed, and yet there were moments of strange tenderness. Once, when I adjusted the lace at her throat, she caught my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes, weary yet sharp, met mine. "Do not pity me, child," she whispered. "The crown allows no pity." Her words have never left me. When death finally came, it was as much a ritual as life had been. The body was washed with wine, rubbed with herbs, and painted once more with powders and rouge. I stood by as her heart was removed, placed in a gilded casket, her entrails in another. The body, sewn and dressed in satin, was laid for viewing. Courtiers wept, the people prayed, but only we knew the truth of what lay beneath. I write these words years later, far from the court, my hands roughened by farm work, my hair streaked with gray. But I remember still the weight of that chamber, the scent of roses and decay, the silence we all kept. I remember the queen not as the world saw her, radiant, majestic, eternal, but as she was, frail, suffering, enduring. And perhaps that memory is the truest crown I can give her. I have served 3 kings and 2 queens, and none have taught me as much as Her Majesty. To the world, I am a man of science, trained in the universities of Paris, a master of humors and balance. But to myself, I am a witness to the frailty of power, disguised in silk. When I first examined her, she was young still, radiant in the eyes of her subjects. Her skin glowed, her laughter filled the halls. But I, trained to look beyond, saw the early signs, the swelling of her gums, the faint rash beneath the powder, the restless twitch of her hands. I knew what awaited her, though I did not speak it. For who dares tell a queen she is mortal? We began with simples, draughts of herbs to ease her stomach, powders to strengthen her nerves. When these failed, I prescribed what all my books confirmed, bloodletting to balance her excess. She trembled at the first cut, but did not resist. Her eyes met mine, filled with terror, yet she nodded. From that day, her body became my battlefield. Leeches fed upon her arms until she fainted. We applied poultices of dung and vinegar to her sores. I gave her mercury to chase away her headaches, arsenic to sharpen her eyes. I watched her weaken, and still I told myself, this is healing, this is balance, this is duty. But there were nights when I doubted, when I saw her carried to bed, to weep, to walk, whispering prayers through her clenched teeth. When I smelled the stench of her breath, blackened by sugar and neglect. When I saw her maid scratching her scalp beneath wigs alive with lice. I doubted, yet I dared not stop, for to deny her treatment was to deny the science of centuries and to risk my own ruin. I ask myself now, was I healer or executioner? I gave her pain in the name of cure, poison in the name of strength, and yet she endured. Perhaps that endurance is proof that even my cruel remedies could not break her. Perhaps. Or perhaps she was simply stronger than all of us. She came to me not as queen, but as soul. Beneath the crown, beneath the jewels, beneath the powder, she was still mortal. And mortality breeds fear. I heard her confessions in whispers, the perfumed veil of her breath mingling with the faint odor of sickness. She spoke of vanity, of her hatred for the powders that burned her skin, of the wigs that tore her hair, of the jewels that weighed upon her head like stones. She confessed to pride, to anger, to envy of the peasant women who could bathe freely in rivers while she lay stifled in silks. And she wept. But her greatest sin, she believed, was despair. "Father," she whispered, "I fear I am not the image they think I am. I fear that beneath this mask, I am nothing." I told her God saw the soul, not the flesh. Yet even as I spoke, I smelled the rot of her teeth, saw the blackened edges of her gums, And I wondered, did she fear God's judgment or man's disgust? She begged me to pray for her body, not only her soul. She feared the pain of bloodletting, the humiliation of enemies, the crawling of vermin in her hair. But more than all, she feared being seen without powder, without perfume, without illusion. If they see me as I am, she said, they will cease to believe. And if they cease to believe, I am no queen at all. In her final days, she confessed nothing of politics, nothing of crowns, only of flesh, of sores that would not heal, of breath that stank despite perfumes, of the terror of decay. She clutched my hand, her rings cutting into my skin, and whispered, "Tell them I was beautiful." That was her last confession. I am no noble, no scholar, no priest. I am a woman who sues. And yet, I think I knew Her Majesty better than most, for I touched what others only gazed upon. When I measured her waist, I felt the bones of her stays pressing deep into her flesh. When I fitted her gowns, I saw the sores on her shoulders, rubbed raw by velvet. When I bent close to pin a hem, I smelled the musk of sweat beneath the perfume. Others saw silks. I saw skin. She was patient with me, more than with her ladies or her doctors. Sometimes she spoke as I worked. "Does it look grand?" she asked once, as I fastened a gown heavy with pearls. "Grand enough that they forget the rest?" I nodded, though my heart ached, for I had seen the rest, the hair falling in patches, the gums bleeding, the hands trembling. Once, as I laced her bodice, a louse crawled across her collar. I reached quickly, crushed it between my nails, and pretended nothing had happened. She looked at me, and she knew. For a moment, her mask cracked. She smiled, not the smile of a queen, but of a weary woman who had long ceased to be surprised by humiliation. When she died, I was summoned to dress her. Her body was stiff, her skin pale and blotched. I powdered her face until it looked smooth again, painted her lips, arranged her wig. As I tied the ribbons beneath her chin, I thought, now she is at peace. For the first time, she does not feel the weight, but even then, the illusion remained. The people wept for a queen who never truly existed. Only I, and others like me, remembered the woman beneath the silk. I was the keeper of her table, though I never once dined there myself. To the world, the queen's meals were feasts of glory, gilded dishes, mountains of sweetmeats, fountains of wine. But I, who labored in the kitchens, knew the truth. Much of it was illusion, a theater of abundance that concealed her frailty. Sugar was our master. Every day, I was commanded to prepare candied fruits, marzipan sculptures, pastries drenched in syrup. The queen loved them, though her teeth were long since ruined. She chewed slowly, wincing, then waved the plate away. More often, the sweets returned untouched, but we had to display them nonetheless. For her court measured Her Majesty in sugar dot, and yet, the very air of the kitchens was thick with rot. The meats, though roasted with spices, often turned before they reached the table. The fish, brought from distant rivers, stank by the time it arrived. We poured vinegar, wine, and cinnamon to mask the odor, but I could smell it still when I bent over the pots. I saw the consequences. Servants carried away bowls of vomit after her meals, for her stomach could not bear the richness. I knew of the purges prescribed by physicians, of enemas delivered after banquets, of the queen's fainting fits when the food weighed heavily. And yet, each day I prepared more, for abundance was power, and truth had no place on the royal table. Once, when she summoned me privately, she asked for something simple, broth of chicken, without spice, without wine. Her voice was hoarse, her hands trembling. I prepared it myself, plain and clear, and when she tasted it, she closed her eyes as if she had sipped freedom. But the next day, before the court, she again dined upon candied wonders and gilded meats. Illusion demanded it. I was her cook, but I never fed her truly. I fed the mask, not the woman. I played the viol in her chambers, and I learned quickly that music was not only art, it was cover. When her physicians worked, when her bowels rebelled, when her breath came ragged with pain, I was commanded to play. The courtiers beyond the doors heard not the sounds of suffering, but the strains of harmony. I remember one night especially. The queen was being bled, her arms bound with cloth, her skin pale as marble. She groaned softly, and the leeches fell into their bowls, fat with her blood. I played louder, filling the chamber with dance tunes, though the rhythm shook with my trembling hands. Her eyes met mine once, and in them I saw gratitude, not for the music, but for the veil it cast. At feasts, I played while she chewed cloves to mask her breath. At masses, I played while fleas jumped across her sleeves. At funerals, I played while bodies swelled in coffins. Always the same, music to drown truth. We musicians laughed sometimes, bitterly, that we were hired liars. Our strings spoke of joy while chambers stank of vinegar and death. And yet, we continued, for silence would have revealed too much. The queen loved music. Truly, in her rare private hours, she asked for soft airs, for songs of love and longing. Then her face softened, her mask dropped, and she seemed almost human, almost free. But the moment never lasted. Duty called, the mask returned, and the vial once again became a shield against truth. I was the eyes of my king in her court, and I learned quickly to see not only what was shown, but what was hidden. To my sovereign I wrote of grandeur, the glittering gowns, the shining jewels, the feasts of sugar, the towers of wigs. But in my private diary, I recorded another truth. The queen's smile was shadowed, her teeth blackened. Her breath, though veiled in clove and musk, carried the faint stench of decay. Her face, powdered white, showed cracks at the edges, where sores peeked through. At receptions, I bowed and praised her radiance, but in my heart I pitied her. One evening, after a banquet, I was permitted closer than most. I saw her lift her glass of wine, her hand trembling so that the jewels shook in candlelight. She sipped, winced, and set it down. A maid hurried to steady her. She smiled again, the perfect mask, and all applauded. But I had seen the tremor, and I wrote of it that night. The queen is not as eternal as she appears. Her body betrays her majesty, though she hides it well. Among ambassadors we whispered of these things, carefully, never in public. We compared notes, the Queen of Spain coughing blood into handkerchiefs, the Queen of Austria fainting from purges, the Queen of France scratching beneath her wig. Each kingdom had its illusions, each queen her suffering. And yet, to the world, they remained radiant. I carried my reports across seas and borders. My king read of splendor, not of sores. For politics demanded masks as surely as crowns demanded jewels. But in the margins of my letters, unseen by all, I wrote the truth, that queens were women first, and their suffering was the secret currency of power. The day began not with dawn, but with ritual. In the queen's chambers, sunlight rarely entered, for the shutters were kept closed against the corrupt air. Instead, candles flickered even in the morning, filling the heavy velvet room with smoke. I, a maid barely more than a child, stepped quietly with a basin of wine to wash her lips. The queen stirred upon her pillows, her face already a mask. Her skin, powdered pale, seemed carved from marble. Her lips, painted vermilion, trembled as she pressed her fingers into the wine. Around her, physicians murmured, ladies adjusted silks, priests whispered blessings. To the world she was eternal majesty. To me, standing so close I could smell the sourness beneath the perfume. She was a woman hiding pain. Soon came the matter of food. Down in the kitchens, the air was thick with smoke, vinegar, and spices. The cook commanded armies of boys and servants, each stirring, chopping, roasting. Platters of gilded meats, towers of sugared fruits, oceans of wine were prepared daily. Though much of it the queen could scarcely eat. Her teeth were ruined, her stomach weakened. Still, the illusion demanded abundance. I once watched her take a single sip of broth, eyes closing in relief, before turning again to the theater of candied wonders. When she appeared in public, Music drowned all else. Violins and flutes filled the halls as she processed, her wigs towering, her gown glittering. We musicians played not only to entertain, but to conceal, to cover the groans. When physicians bled her, to mask the coughs that shook her frame, to veil the scratching of lice beneath powdered wigs. Sound became a shield, harmony against decay died at night. In the stillness of the chapel, she whispered confessions to her priest. There, the mask slipped. She spoke of vanity, of pride, of despair. She envied the peasant women who bathed in rivers while she suffocated beneath silks. She feared being seen without powder. If they see me as I am, she confessed, they will cease to believe. And without belief, I am no queen. Her last request to him was simple. Tell them I was beautiful. The physicians, meanwhile, ruled her body like generals of suffering. They cut her veins, pressed leeches to her skin, poured mercury upon her sores, arsenic into her wine. They bled her to weakness, purged her to collapse, then proclaimed success. I saw her lips whiten as the blood flowed, heard her prayers as she endured. They called it science. I called it torment. Yet she submitted, for the crown allowed no refusal. The ambassadors saw only the mask. They wrote of her majesty, her jewels, her towering coiffures. In secret diaries, they confessed pity, her trembling hands, her blackened teeth, her breath masked with cloves. But in letters to their kings, they praised her radiance. For politics, too, was theater. When death came, it was not release but performance. Her body was washed in wine, rubbed with herbs, painted with powders once more. Her heart was sealed in gold, her entrails in silver. She was laid out in silks, her lips red, her cheeks pale with rouge. The people wept, believing in the Queen Eternal. Only we, her servants, her maids, her seamstress, knew the truth of the body beneath. And yet, outside the palace, among the crowds, the memory shifted. A peasant woman who once glimpsed her during procession recalled the glittering gown, the pale face, the jewels that caught the sun. To her, the queen was beauty itself, untouchable. She did not smell the sweat, did not hear the groans, did not see the sores. The mask had worked, the illusion endured. But I, who touched her skin, who held her basin, who dressed her in death, remember another truth. She was not marble nor painting. She was flesh, fragile, suffering, enduring. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of queenship. Not the silks or the crowns, but the endurance of the woman beneath. The chamber is heavy with silence before the rituals begin. Candles burn low, though it is already morning outside. For the shutters are barred against the light. The air is thick. Incense from last night's prayers lingers, mingling with the scent of musk, sweat, and powder. I, one of the youngest maids, kneel with a basin of warmed wine. My hands tremble as I approach the bed. The queen stirs, her breath ragged beneath lips painted crimson the night before. Powder clings to her cheeks in uneven patches. When I lean closer, I smell clove and rot, the perfume of her mouth fighting a losing battle against decay. She dips her fingers into the wine, presses them to her lips, winces. Her eyes open, sharp, commanding, as if the pain is nothing. Begin, she whispers, and the room springs to life. The wig is lifted, heavy, stiff with powder. Beneath it, the scalp is red and raw, lice crawling. We scratch gently with ivory sticks, collecting the tiny corpses on cloth. Powder falls like snow upon the bed, choking us as we breathe. Perfumed oils are rubbed into her skin, though beneath the mask sores remain. Physicians arrive. They peer at her complexion, debating in whispers. Too pale, one says. Excessive phlegm. The cure, leeches. A bowl of writhing creatures is brought. They are pressed to her arms, her thighs, even her temples. She closes her eyes as they feed, blood trickling down. Musicians outside play softly to cover the sounds. By the time the bleeding is finished, she is weak. We lift her gently, bathe her lips again in wine, lace her into gowns so heavy she can scarcely move. Jewels weigh upon her neck, pearls press against her chest. She rises, a fragile body disguised as majesty. The kitchens roar like a battlefield. Fires blaze, spits turn, pots boil with spices and sugar. The cook barks orders, boys run with platters. The air is so thick with smoke and vinegar I can hardly breathe. On the table above, feasts are arranged, roasted meats gilded with gold, fruits candied until unrecognizable, wine spiced with cinnamon. The queen's plate gleams, but she eats little. Her teeth ache too much. She touches a marzipan swan, breaks it gently, sets it aside. A servant whispers to me later that her stomach cannot bear the food, that vomit bowls are hidden nearby. Still, the feast must be shown, for to dine poorly is to appear weak. I once carried her a simple broth, plain and clear. She drank, sighed with relief, and whispered, "This is what I crave." But in the next breath, she commanded more sugared fruits for the table. Illusion before comfort, always illusion. Ceremonies begin. The court assembles, silks rustle, jewels blaze. The queen sits beneath a canopy, her powdered face serene, her lips crimson, her wig towering. We, the unseen, hide behind curtains, ready with cloths, perfumes, and pens. Musicians play, filling the chamber with viols and flutes. I see her tremble, her hand shaking slightly as she lifts a goblet. The ambassador from Spain watches, noting nothing aloud, though his eyes narrow. Later, in his diary, he will write of her pallor, her trembling, her breath masked with cloves. But now, before all, she is radiant. Children of nobles are presented. She smiles, her teeth black, gums bleeding beneath the paint. A faint smell rises when she speaks. Still, courtiers bow. Ambassadors praise her beauty, for none dare admit the truth. The mask must endure at vespers. The chapel glows with candles. She kneels, her body swaying slightly, supported by maids. Her confessor leans close, whispering prayers. Later, in private, she weeps. "I envy the women who bathe in rivers," she says. "I envy their freedom." She clutches his hand. "If they see me as I am, they will cease to believe." He assures her God sees the soul, not the flesh. But she shakes her head. "My kingdom does not look at souls. The confession is not of politics, not of war or rule, but of flesh, of sores that fester, of lice that crawl, of the terror of being seen. Tell them I was beautiful," she begs. "Tell them I was loved." The chamber fills again with smoke. Physicians return with purges and powders. She swallows bitter draughts, vomits into bowls. Servants carry away cloths reeking of sickness. Musicians play to drown the sound. She collapses into bed, pale, lips cracked. We comb powder into her wig, perfume her skin, prepare her once more for the morning. Outside, the city sleeps. A peasant woman, walking past the palace gates, looks up at the lit windows and imagines splendor. To her, the queen is beauty untouchable, eternal. She cannot smell the rot, cannot hear the coughs, cannot see the sores. Illusion stretches from chamber to street. But I, who scratch her scalp, who carry her vomit, who paint her lips in death, know the truth. She is not marble, not eternal. She is flesh, fragile, suffering, enduring. And in that endurance lies her truest crown. The palace never truly slept, even in the silence of the night, when torches guttered low and shadows stretched across the marble floors. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the endless corridors. Servants moved like ghosts, carrying bowls of vinegar, bundles of linen, trays of herbs. The air was never fresh. It was heavy with perfumes, smoke, and the sweet, sickly scent of bodies wrapped in velvet. At the heart of it all lay the queen. To her people she was majesty incarnate, untouchable, eternal. But for those of us who served, who carried her basins, who laced her gowns, who combed her wigs, she was fragile flesh beneath a crown. Each day began with ritual, not renewal. Curtains remained drawn against the light. The sun was feared as much as water. Candles burned always, their wax dripping, their smoke clinging to tapestries. The queen stirred, her lips painted crimson the night before, her skin still coated in powder that had begun to crack in the creases. When she opened her eyes, the chamber came alive with whispers, bows, and duties. The wig was never truly removed, only adjusted. Powder fell like snow across pillows, mixing with sweat. Beneath it, her scalp burned red, alive with lice. We scratched gently with ivory sticks, careful not to disturb the elaborate towers of hair. Gardens of ribbon and wire. The smell beneath was sour, yet she endured it without complaint, for to appear bald was unthinkable. When sores broke the skin, physicians dabbed them with mercury ointment. They told her it would heal. Instead, it burned deeper. Physicians were always present, their words more command than advice. They studied her complexion like a map of destiny. Too pale, and they declared phlegm in excess. Too flushed, and they demanded bleeding. Bowls of leeches were brought, their black bodies writhing. They were pressed to her arms, her legs, her temples. She lay still as they fed, her eyes turned heavenward, her lips moving in prayer. When the blood dripped, musicians outside struck their bows harder, drowning the sound. We maids wiped her skin, carried away linen spotted with crimson, and said nothing. Silence was survival. By midday, the palace roared with the illusion of abundance. Kitchens smoked like battlefields, spits turned, pots boiled. Meat gleamed under gilded crusts, fish stank beneath mountains of spice. Fruits were drowned in sugar until they were unrecognizable. The air burned with vinegar and cinnamon. The queen's table was a theater of plenty, though she herself could scarcely eat. Her teeth blackened with rot, her gums bleeding, she chewed slowly, wincing. Often she left plates untouched. But the feast was not for her. It was for those who watched. To dine poorly was weakness. To display abundance was power. I remember one day when she summoned me privately. Her voice was hoarse, her hands trembling. "Bring me broth," she whispered. I carried her a simple bowl of clear chicken stock. She sipped, closed her eyes, and sighed as though tasting freedom. "This," she said softly, "this is what I need." But by the next morning, sugar returned to her table, and with it the mask of excess. Comfort was sacrificed to illusion. Ceremonies filled the afternoons. She sat beneath a canopy, her gown glittering, her jewels weighing heavy upon her chest. Courtiers bowed, ambassadors smiled, musicians played. Her wig towered high, powdered white, a monument to artifice. She smiled faintly, her lips crimson, though when she spoke the smell of clove pasty mixed with the faint stench of decay. I saw the ambassador's eyes flicker. He noticed, though he would never say it aloud. In his letters home, he would write of splendor, but in his private diary he would confess pity. When courtiers presented children, she reached out with trembling hands, her rings glinting in the candlelight. She smiled for them, though blood glistened faintly at her gums. They bowed, unseeing. Illusion endured, evenings brought prayers. The chapel glowed with candles, smoke rising to the vaulted ceiling. She knelt, her body swaying, her maid steadying her arms. Alone with her confessor, her mask slipped. "I envy the women in rivers," she whispered once. "Their freedom, their flesh unbound." She confessed not sins of state, but sins of flesh, vanity, despair, envy. She feared being seen. "If they see me as I am," she said, "they will cease to believe. And if they cease to believe, I am no queen at all." Her last request to him, whispered with trembling lips, was simple: "Tell them I was beautiful. Nights were the cruelest." Physicians returned with purges and powders. She drank draughts bitter with herbs and metal, retched into bowls while musicians played to cover the sound. We maids carried away cloths soaked in sickness, washed her lips with wine, perfumed her skin with rose water. She collapsed upon her bed, pale, her body trembling, her breath heavy with cloves. And still, before she closed her eyes, she whispered orders for tomorrow. The mask could never rest. Seasons passed within those chambers, each marked not by sunlight or weather, but by rituals. In spring, powders of flower dusted wigs like snow, leaving the halls cloudy with white. In summer, the heat thickened the air, the shutters sealed, fires burning to purify, and the queen's cough worsened. Autumn brought more feasts, heavier meats, richer sweets that she could scarcely touch. Winter was endless, the cold creeping into tapestries, her body shivering beneath silks while incense smoldered to chase away corruption. Her body aged quickly beneath the weight. The sores deepened, the breath grew fouler, the teeth nearly gone. Yet before the court, she remained radiant. Ambassadors still bowed, courtiers still praised. The people, glimpsing her from afar, believed in her perfection. Only we, the unseen hands, knew the truth of her flesh when death came. It followed ritual too. The body was washed with wine, rubbed with herbs, powdered, painted. The heart removed, placed in gold, the entrails sealed in silver. She was dressed in satin, her lips painted red, her cheeks pale with rouge. The people wept at her beauty. Only we, who touched her skin, knew it was allusion to the end outside. Peasants remembered her as they had glimpsed her in procession, pale, radiant, eternal. To them, she was majesty. To us, she was human, fragile, suffering, enduring. And perhaps that is her truest crown. The palace breathed like a creature of its own. Its walls, layered with velvet and tapestries, never allowed silence to settle completely. In the night, footsteps echoed endlessly, servants carrying trays of herbs, basins of vinegar, torches that left smoke curling upward into the high beams. The corridors smelled of wine, incense, and something else, something human, sour, always there. No matter how much perfume was poured over it, at the center of it all was she, the queen. To the world she was majesty carved in stone, eternal, untouched by time. To us, the hands that dressed her, that washed her lips, that carried away her stained linens. She was fragile flesh painted, powdered, perfumed, and yet inescapably mortal. Her mornings began in shadow, not light. The shutters were always sealed against the sun, for the air outside was thought to be corrupt. Instead, candles burned down to their nubs, filling her chamber with smoke. She stirred slowly, lips still painted from the night before, powder cracked across her cheeks. When her eyes opened, sharp and commanding despite her exhaustion, the chamber sprang to life. Physicians whispered diagnoses, lays adjusted silks, priests murmured blessings. And always, I, with my basin of warm wine, ready to wash her lips, trembling at the closeness of her breath, a breath sweet with clove, sour with decay. The wigs were monuments in themselves, towers of hair powdered white until they smoked at every movement. Beneath them the truth lived, raw scalp, crawling lice, the faint ooze of sores. We scratched carefully with ivory sticks, catching the lice on cloth. The queen endured, jaw tight, eyes unfocused, while physicians promised the ointments of mercury would heal her skin. Instead they burned, but she bore it, for to appear bald was more terrible than the pain. Then came the bleeding. The physicians debated her complexion like scholars poring over holy scripture. To pale, to cold they declared imbalance, an excess of phlegm. The bowls of leeches were brought. I watched them wriggle as they were pressed to her arms, her thighs, her very temples. She closed her eyes as they fed, her lips moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in resignation. Her blood darkened the cloth, and beyond the chamber musicians played louder, drowning the sounds. We wiped her arms, carried away the linen spotted red, and never spoke of it. By midday, the kitchens boiled with smoke and noise. Fires roared, boys ran with platters, and the air was thick with spice, vinegar, and sugar. Feasts were created for her table, meats glazed in gold, fish buried beneath mountains of cinnamon, fruits candied until their true form was lost. The queen's table gleamed with excess, yet she could eat so little. Her teeth blackened and broken, her gums bleeding, she tasted cautiously, wincing. Often she pushed plates aside untouched, yet the illusion demanded display. For a queen to dine poorly was weakness. For her table to overflow was power. Once, in a moment rare and fragile, she summoned me privately. Her voice was thin, her hands trembling. "Bring me broth," she whispered. I carried to her a plain bowl of clear chicken broth. She drank slowly, closed her eyes, and sighed as though the taste itself lifted a burden. "This," she murmured, "this is what I need." Yet the next morning, sugar towers returned, and she returned to her role. Illusion always before comfort. Afternoons belonged to ceremony. She sat beneath her canopy, pearls glinting. Her gown so heavy with embroidery it strained her breath. Her wig towered high, her face powdered, lips painted vermilion. Ambassadors bowed, courtiers praised, musicians filled the air with sound. She raised a goblet, her hand trembling so slightly that only those of us near could see. The Spanish ambassador's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. In letters home, he wrote of radiance. In his private diary, he confessed pity. When children of noble families were brought forward, she smiled for them, touched their heads with trembling hands. The crimson of her lips gleamed, but beneath it her gums bled faintly. The children, Bowen, saw only majesty. Illusion endured that as twilight fell. The chapel glowed with candles. She knelt in prayer, her body swaying, her lady steadying her arms. Alone with her confessor, she wept. "I envy the women who bathe in rivers," she whispered once. "I envy their freedom." Her sins were not of politics, but of flesh, vanity, envy, despair. She feared being seen as she was. "If they see me," she said, "they will cease to believe. And if they cease to believe, I am no queen." Her last plea to him was simple, desperate. Tell them I was beautiful. Nights were filled with torment. Physicians returned with purges, powders, draughts bitter with herbs and metal. She swallowed, gagged, vomited into bowls while music played louder to hide the sound. We carried away cloths reeking of sickness, washed her lips with wine, perfumed her skin with roses. Her body trembled, her face pale, her breath heavy with cloves. And yet, before her eyes closed, she whispered orders for tomorrow. Duty never slept. Seasons folded into each other. Spring filled the halls with powder drifting like snow, wigs smoking with each movement. Summer pressed hot and heavy, shutters sealed, fires burning to purify. And the queen coughed through the nights. Autumn meant feasts, richer, heavier, though her stomach rebelled against them. Winter was endless, the cold seeping through walls, her body shivering even beneath silks. While incense smoldered to chase away the corruption of the air, the years wore her down. Sores deepened, her breath grew fouler, her teeth nearly gone. Yet before her court she remained eternal. Courtiers bowed, ambassadors praised. The people, glimpsing her carriage, wept for her beauty. Only we, the unseen, knew the truth. And when death came, it was theater too. The body washed with wine, rubbed with herbs, powdered, painted. The heart sealed in gold, the entrails in silver. She was laid in silks, lips red, cheeks pale with rouge. The people wept at her beauty. Only we, who touched her flesh, knew the illusion had lasted until the end. Outside the palace, peasants spoke of her as they had glimpsed her once in procession, radiant, pale, eternal. They remembered not the cough, not the sores, not the scent of rot. They remembered majesty. The mask had triumphed. But I, who saw her flesh, who carried her basins, who dressed her in death, remember a different truth. She was not marble. She was not eternal. She was human, fragile, suffering, enduring. And perhaps in that endurance lay her truest crown. The palace did not belong to one season. It belonged to all of them, and to none. Within its heavy walls, time did not flow as it did for peasants in the fields, marked by planting and harvest. Here, time was counted in candles burned, in powder spread, and the number of times blood was drained from the queen's body. Spring crept in with a scent of damp earth outside, though none of it entered her chambers. The shutters stayed closed. The only air was heavy with incense and musk. Yet spring announced itself in another way through powder. The wigs were refreshed with flour and starch. Great clouds of white dust rising like blizzards as the ladies dressed her. I remember how my throat burned, how my nose filled with it until I could scarcely breathe. She sat still beneath the falling whiteness, her eyes half closed, her lips already painted, while her scalp bled beneath the pressure of her crown. Summer pressed hard against the walls. Though no windows opened, fires were lit, always, to purify the air, so the heat grew unbearable. Sweat rolled down her neck, soaking her silks. Though we rushed forward with fans of peacock feathers, with cloths soaked in rose water, the smell was sweet and sour, perfume fighting sweat, incense smothering rot. She coughed often then, a dry, rasping cough that shook her body even as she forced her lips to smile. Physicians said it was the imbalance of humors, and they drained her again. Bowls of blood filled, her skin paled, and still she was dressed once more in velvet. Jewels heavy upon her chest. Autumn brought feasts. The kitchens thundered with noise, meats roasted, sugar boiled, fish drowned in spices. Tables sagged beneath mountains of food, though she touched little of it. Sometimes she bit a sugared fruit, sometimes a sip of spiced wine. And then her lips tightened in pain. I knew of the vomit bowls hidden behind the curtains. I saw the sweat on the cook's face, the trembling of his hands as he carried gilded dishes, knowing none would be eaten. But the show was necessary. Nobles bowed before excess, not simplicity. A queen was measured by sugar, not by bread. Winter was endless. The cold crept into every corner, despite fires roaring. Her hands, already thin and trembling, turned blue at the fingertips. We rubbed them with warm cloths, poured wine over her lips, laid furs across her bed. Still she shivered. The incense burned thicker then, for winter was thought to carry plague. The air grew unbreathable. At night, I lay in my narrow bed, my head pounding with the smoke, and wondered how she endured it. But in the morning, she rose again, powdered, painted, crowned. Year followed year, and I watched her body change. The sores deepened, her gums bled more, her teeth blackened and crumbled. Her breath grew heavier, so thick with clothes and musk it clung to us when we stood near. Her hands shook more, her steps faltered, yet in public she sat beneath her canopy, serene as marble. Ambassadors continued to praise her beauty. The people continued to believe. Illusion thickened like the powders on her face. And always, the rituals, the wigs powdered, the silks laced, the jewels fastened, the physicians bleeding, purging, dosing, the confessions whispered in the chapel, her voice breaking as she begged to be remembered as beautiful. Nights filled with retching, with cloths carried away, with musicians playing to hide the sounds of her suffering. I remember the day a mirror cracked in her chamber. It had stood for years, reflecting her painted face, her jeweled neck. One morning, as the wig was set upon her head, the mirror split down the middle, a long thin line from top to bottom. She stared at it in silence, her lips trembling, and then whispered, "Do not let them see this." The mirror was covered with cloth, but I saw the fear in her eyes. Perhaps she believed in an omen. Perhaps it was only truth breaking through illusion. The people outside the palace knew none of this. They waited in the cold for a glimpse of her carriage, their breath fogging in the air, their eyes wide with awe. When she passed, wrapped in silks, face pale with powder, jewels flashing in the sun, they cheered. To them, she was eternal beauty. They could not smell what I smelled, could not hear what I heard. They believed, and their belief was the crown upon her head. But belief could not stop Tom. The winters grew harsher for her body, the summers heavier. Her hands trembled too much to hold a goblet. Her lips cracked beneath the paint. Her cough deepened, and her eyes, once sharp and commanding, dulled with exhaustion. Yet she endured, always enduring, because the crown demanded it, and when the end came, it came as everything else had, in ritual. The body washed in wine, rubbed with herbs, powdered white, painted red. Her heart taken in gold, her entrails sealed in silver. Laid in satin, she was beauty again, if only for the eyes of those who believed. The people wept at her perfection. Only we knew it was illusion, painted even in death years later. Peasants still told stories of her beauty, her grace, her majesty. They remembered the vision from afar, not the truth from within. But I, who touched her skin, who heard her prayers, who saw her vomit carried away in bowls, I remember another woman, not marble, not eternal, human, fragile, suffering, enduring, and perhaps in that endurance, there was a majesty greater than crowns. The queen was gone, but the palace still breathed. For weeks after her body was sealed in its coffin of silver and gold, her scent lingered in the corridors, the clove, the musk, the faint undertone of rot hidden beneath perfume. Servants still moved like shadows, out of habit, though their mistress no longer called. Curtains remained drawn, candles burned, incense smoked. It was as if the palace itself refused to admit she had left. But outside, beyond the gates, the story had already changed. The people who had wept as her coffin passed through the streets told each other tales of her beauty, her grace, her divine majesty. No one spoke of sores, of vomit, of leeches. They spoke of jewels glittering in candlelight, of lips red as roses, of gowns that shone like dawn. Mothers told daughters they had seen an angel, not a woman. Children carried flowers to her statue, pressing them against cold marble. Among courtiers, silence became law. To question her beauty, even in memory, was treason against the illusion. Ambassadors who had written of her weakness in secret diaries now published memoirs praising her radiance. Pain was erased. Decay was buried. Only majesty remained. Yet some of us remembered differently. Old servants, dismissed after her death, wandered the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I met one once, an old man who had carried the basins in which she vomited. His hands still smelled faintly of vinegar, though years had passed. They call her eternal beauty, he told me bitterly. But I held her hair while she retched. I saw her gums bleed. Eternal beauty? No. Eternal suffering. He laughed, a hollow sound, and coughed into his sleeve. Another was a seamstress, bent with age, her fingers twisted. She told her granddaughter stories of silks that grew heavy with sweat, of gowns so tight they cut into flesh. But the child did not believe her. Grandmother, she said, the queen was the most beautiful woman who ever lived. And the seamstress, weary, said no more. Time worked its alchemy. Within a generation, her image was no longer of flesh but of legend. Pain faded, but paintings remained. In the portraits, she was serene, powdered, radiant, immortal. Chroniclers wrote of her devotion, her magnificence, her elegance. None wrote of the lice combs, the vinegar basins, the cracked mirror covered with cloth dot in the countryside. Peasants told stories of how she had blessed the land with her presence, how crops grew taller when her carriage passed, how children lived longer for having seen her face. They built myths upon the briefest glimpses, weaving miracles from illusion. The truth of her suffering had no place in their tales, but not all forgot. I remember walking once through a market where a toothless old woman sold herbs. She leaned close and whispered, I was a laundress in the palace. I washed her linens. Do you know what I saw? Blood, sweat, filth. And now they build statues. Her eyes shone with both anger and pity. She was a woman, like us, but caged in jewels. Statues rose anyway. Poems were written, hymns composed. Her name became a prayer upon the lips of the faithful. In churches, priests described her beauty as a reflection of divine order. And slowly, the truth was buried beneath marble and song. Yet sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear her voice. Not the voice that commanded nations, but the whisper in the chapel, trembling, broken. Tell them I was beautiful, and I wonder if she knew, even then, that her request would erase her. For they did tell us she was beautiful. They told it so loudly, so endlessly, that the woman herself vanished. Only the mask remained. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of queenship, that even death does not free the woman. Only the mask. The queen was gone, sealed in her satin and silver. But she had not truly left. In the halls of power, her name was still spoken daily, not as a woman, but as a weapon, as a tool, as an eternal symbol. Her successor demanded chronicles be written, portraits painted, hymns composed. And so, the queen who had lived in suffering was reborn in ink and paint as a goddess. I knew one of the chroniclers, a man with sharp eyes and a trembling hand. He confessed to me once, in the dark of an archive, that he had seen her in her last days. Her breath reeked of cloves, he whispered. Her hands shook as she held a rosary. She was pale, cracked, broken, and yet I must write of her beauty, her glory, her divine majesty. If I write truth, I am finished. So I write lies. His quill scratched across parchment, and each word buried her flesh deeper beneath marble dot beyond the palace in the villages. Her memory transformed into story. An old woman told her grandchildren of the day she had seen the queen's carriage pass through muddy streets. Her gown sparkled, the woman said, though in truth it had been dulled by dust. Her skin shone like ivory, though the woman had been far enough away to see only a blur of pale powder. The children gasped, eyes wide, imagining a goddess descending to earth. That one moment, fleeting, became a legend retold for generations. Died in the city. Statues rose, marble faces serene, lips curved in soft smiles, eyes lifted toward heaven. Artists competed to capture her perfection, though none of them had ever seen her. They worked from descriptions that had already been polished into myth. Yet I recall one painter, a young man chosen to create her official death portrait. He told me later of the night he stood before her body. They wanted beauty, he said, his hands trembling. But I saw sores. I smelled decay. They told me to smooth her skin, to brighten her eyes, to paint her lips redder than they were. I obeyed. And yet, as I painted, I wept. For I erased her. His portrait now hangs in the palace still, admired by crowds who see only majesty, never the truth behind the brush strokes. Years passed, and her story thickened with silence. The truth whispered among old servants died with them, carried into graves unmarked. But sometimes truth clawed its way upward, like weeds through stone. I have read, in secret, a letter written by a physician's apprentice, hidden in the back of an archive chest. He wrote of the bloodlettings, the mercury ointments, the vomit bowls. They call her divine, he wrote, but I saw her weep like a child. His words were never meant to be read, but I found them, and they burned in my hands. A century later, scholars wrote of her reign as golden. Priests preached her as blessed. Songs still carried her name on the lips of peasants. And yet, once in a rare while, a fragment of truth surfaced, a cracked mirror in a cellar, a servant's diary in faded ink, a rumor of lice combs and vinegar basins. But these fragments were easily dismissed, smothered beneath hymns of glory. Her image had outlived her flesh, her suffering, her cries in the chapel. The queen had become to beings, the woman we who served her knew, and the goddess the world believed in. The goddess won. The woman was forgotten. And perhaps that is the cruelest immortality, to live forever, not as yourself, but as the mask they needed you to be. Decades passed, and then centuries. The palace walls changed, stones crumbled and were replaced, but her image remained untouched. The queen lived on in marble statues and gilded portraits, in the words of poets who had never seen her, and with each retelling, she grew further from the truth and closer to legend. In the first decades after her death, her name was used as a shield. Her successor invoked her beauty and her piety to legitimize his rule. She smiles upon us from heaven, priests declared from pulpits. Her suffering, her sickness, her whispered prayers in the chapel were never mentioned. Instead, she was painted as the perfect mother of her people, an image repeated until it hardened into fact. A century later, during famine, her memory was wielded like a blade. Rulers reminded the starving peasants, did she not endure hardship with grace? Did she not shine even in suffering? Be as patient as your queen was. I once read a pamphlet from that time, where her likeness adorned the cover, powdered and serene. The words beneath urge obedience. The irony burned in me. They used her suffering, which had been hidden, to To demand silence from those who truly suffered, artists painted her anew. One canvas showed her walking in gardens, though she had rarely touched open air. Another showed her blessing a child, though her hands had trembled too much to hold her own goblet. A famous poet called her the pearl without blemish, never knowing the stench of clothes and rot that clung to her breath. Truth had no place in their verses. And yet, truth survived in fragments. In a small archive, a scholar once uncovered the diary of a laundress who had washed her linens. The ink was faded, the words simple, but they spoke of blood, sweat, and filth. The scholar published them, timidly, but his work was dismissed as scandal. Lies from the lower orders, they said. The diary was locked away again, and her marble face continued to smile in every square. 2 centuries later, revolution stirred. Crowds toppled statues, burned effigies, tore down paintings. Yet even then, her name survived. Some cursed her as a tyrant, others defended her as a saint. In both cases, the woman herself was gone. Only symbols remained. She was no longer flesh, nor even memory. She was a weapon for whoever held her image. I remember standing in a ruined church where her portrait still hung, half burned, the paint blistered by fire. A boy stared at it, wide-eyed. She was beautiful, he whispered. He saw the ruined face, cracked and blackened, and still he believed. Such is the power of illusion, that even ashes can shine. And now, centuries after her death, scholars still argue, was she the most beautiful queen of her age? Or was she a victim of cruelty disguised as majesty? Was she saintly or vain? Few read the hidden letters, the confessions, the records of bleeding and vomit. They read only the marble inscriptions, the hymns, the polished portraits. The woman who whispered, "Tell them I was beautiful," has been obeyed too well. They told it, until all else was erased. But I, who lived within those chambers, who touched her trembling hands, who heard her breath rattle in the night, I know another truth. She was not marble, she was not pearl. She was flesh, fragile and enduring. And though the world has forgotten that flesh, I carry it still. For to remember her humanity is the last rebellion against her mask. Centuries had passed, and still her face gazed down upon the world. Marble statues stood in city squares, their lips curved in serene smiles. Paintings hung in galleries, their powdered cheeks smooth, their eyes soft and kind. Tour guides led crowds of tourists through gilded halls, pointing to portraits and whispering, "Here was the most beautiful queen in history." And no one questioned. In modern books she appears again, reborn with each retelling. Historians write of her elegance, biographers of her virtue, novelists of her romance. Films cast actresses with flawless faces, their teeth white, their skin unblemished, their voices rich with strength. No one shows the sores, the coughs, the vomit bowls hidden behind curtains. No one powders lice into wigs. No one lets her breath, thick with clothes and rot, touch the screen. For who would watch such truth? The audience demands beauty, and so the illusion endures. Even the streets trade her name. A perfume is sold beneath her title, promising eternal grace. A hotel bears her crest, offering guests the fantasy of sleeping in royal chambers. A tour takes visitors past her statues, promising to reveal the secrets of her beauty. But the only secret revealed is that the truth is gone. Her suffering has been polished away until it shines too bright to see behind. I once walked through a museum where her gown was displayed, velvet deep and dark, pearls gleaming in the dim light. Crowds gasped at its grandeur, but I knew. I could almost smell it still, the sweat, the rot, the heavy stench of incense that clung to every thread. They saw majesty. I remembered flesh. Children read picture books that call her a fairy tale queen. Lovers stroll past statues and kiss beneath her gaze. Politicians invoke her name to tie themselves to a golden age that never truly was. And each time her story is told, it grows smoother, brighter, more impossible. The woman vanishes further, the mask grows stronger, yet here and there, fragments remain. In dusty archives, in forgotten corners of libraries, in letters never meant to be read. A diary of a servant writing of vinegar basins. A physician's note confessing failure. A seamstress's complaint of blood on silk. These are the threads of the woman beneath. But who reads them now? They are footnotes, easily ignored. And so the queen lives again, not as she was, but as the world wishes her to be. Eternal beauty, eternal grace, eternal lie. And I, who remember, feel the weight of her whisper still. Tell them I was beautiful. The world obeyed. It obeys still. But sometimes I wonder if she could see what her name has become. Would she rejoice? Or would she weep? For perhaps immortality is not a gift, but a curse, to be remembered forever, and never to be known. Time itself had become her servant. Centuries slipped by, dynasties rose and fell, yet her face remained. In every square, her statue stood unmoved by wind or rain, marble lips curled into eternal smiles. In every gallery, her portraits glowed with powdered radiance, untouched by decay. Generations were born and died beneath her gaze, and the people learned to measure their lives not in years but in the shadow of her illusion. In universities, scholars quarreled. Some claimed she was the embodiment of divine beauty. Others argued she was vain, cruel, or fragile. Books spilled across shelves, each page polished, each word bending her into new shapes. But rarely did anyone seek the woman herself, for the woman was buried, her body sealed long ago in silver, her truth locked away with vinegar basins and blood-soaked linens. I have seen poets kneel before her statue, scribbling verses of alabaster cheeks and ruby lips, as though stone itself had whispered to them. I have seen painters, centuries later, reimagine her in styles she never knew. Romantic, surreal, modern, each brush stroke another mask layered upon the mask. Even filmmakers came, draping actresses in silk and jewels, setting them in candlelit chambers where they whispered lines she never spoke. Crowds wept in theaters, believing at last they had seen her. But they had not. They had only seen the dream. And yet, in the quiet places, fragments of truth survive. A cracked comb, once dragged across her scalp, alive with lice. A mirror, its silver backing darkened, its glass still bearing the faint line of that long fracture. A letter scrawled by a frightened maid, begging her sister never to wish for palace life. These objects lie forgotten in drawers, too small, too ugly to display. But they are more real than all the marble faces and painted canvases. What, then, is immortality? To live forever in marble smiles and powdered cheeks, or to endure in the memory of one trembling hand that held a basin at dawn. The world chose marble, but I, who saw her flesh, I choose the trembling hand. Even now, children are taught that she was perfection, their eyes shining as they repeat the tale. Lovers kiss beneath her statues. Tourists pay coins to walk through her chambers, unaware that the air they breathe is only an echo of the smoke and incense that once choked us all. The illusion grows brighter, while the truth fades further. And perhaps that is the fate of all rulers, to be remembered, but never known. Sometimes, I imagine her standing before her own statue. Would she recognize herself? Would she see the smooth cheeks, the serene eyes, the gentle smile, and whisper, "Yes, that was me"? Or would she laugh bitterly, coughing behind her lace handkerchief, and say, "This is not I, but the mask I wore"? Her last words to me still haunt me. Tell them I was beautiful. She begged not for truth, not for freedom, but for illusion. And so the world obeyed. They obey still. And I wonder, as centuries fold upon centuries, whether her request was a victory or a curse. For the woman has vanished. The queen remains. And perhaps that is the truest tragedy, that to be eternal is to be erased. The centuries did not bury her. They only deepened her shadow. Children of servants grew old telling stories to their grandchildren. Some swore the queen had been a saint, her hands glowing with divine light. Others muttered that she had been a prisoner, broken by the weight of her crown. And the children, listening by the fire, never knew which was truth and which was lie. For both sounded real, and both carried the weight of memory. I once spoke with the grandson of a laundress. His grandmother had whispered to him as a child of blood-stained linens, of vinegar basins that reeked of sickness. But in the city, he heard priests proclaim her purity, poets sing of her beauty, statues rise in her name. Who do I believe? He asked me. The woman who washed her sheets, or the marble that smiles at me from the square? His question still lingers, for it has no answer. Modern scholars pore over archives. They turn pages yellow with age, letters scrawled in fading ink. Some discover fragments of the truth, the complaints of a seamstress, the bitter note of a physician's apprentice, the desperate confession of a maid. But when they publish, their words are drowned in the flood of glossy biographies, films, and novels that sell the queen as beauty incarnate. The market demands illusions, not wounds. And so, even history, once the guardian of truth, becomes another mask. In the palace itself, now a museum, the air still feels heavy. Tourists pass through gilded chambers, their eyes lifted to chandeliers, their cameras flashing. They marvel at the silk, the jewels, the portraits. But those who linger, those who pause in silence, sometimes swear they feel something else. A cough that echoes faintly in the corridor. A faint odor of incense and cloves, lingering though centuries have passed. A whisper, perhaps, behind the glass of the old chapel. Tell them I was beautiful, and I, who have carried the story across lifetimes, wonder if the palace itself remembers. Perhaps the stones have drunk her tears, the wood absorbed her groans. The mirrors still hold her reflection. Perhaps truth cannot be erased, only silence. And if one listens closely enough, beneath the hymns, beneath the lies, beneath the marble smiles, one may still hear the faint heartbeat of the woman herself. Not eternal, not perfect, but real. The queen has been dead for centuries, yet her shadow still lies across the palace like a veil. Walk through its corridors, and you will hear more than the footsteps of tourists. The stones whisper when touched, the wood sighs. The mirrors gleam faintly even in darkness. The air carries something more than dust. It carries memory. In the great hall, chandeliers blaze with electric light now, but their crystals still reflect 1,000 candles that once burned to mask the stench of sickness. Stand long enough beneath them, and you may almost hear the soft groans of a body being laced into velvet too tight, too heavy. The chapel smells of old wood and polish. Yet beneath it lingers the ghost of incense, thick and suffocating. If you press your ear to the stone, you might imagine the sound of a broken whisper. Tell them I was beautiful. Visitors think it is their imagination. But the palace remembers. Scholars argue in libraries, their hands smudged with the dust of old papers. They debate her legacy, some insisting she was divine, others calling her vain, fragile, tragic. Each bills a version of her, and none touch the woman herself. The truth sits between them, hidden, silent, like a locked chest no one dares open. Outside, in the city, statues gleam in sunlight. Lovers kiss beneath their marble gazes. Children climb upon their bases, laughing, unaware that the woman immortalized their once coughed blood into handkerchiefs. Perfume shops still sell bottles in her name, promising eternal allure. Tour guides tell stories rehearsed 1,000 times, never mentioning vomit bowls or vinegar basins. The lie is comfortable. The truth is heavy. But the lie cannot erase all. In hidden corners, fragments remain stubborn. A comb with teeth broken, found in an old drawer. A faded handkerchief marked with brown stains, displayed in no museum, kept in a private box. A cracked mirror, still standing in storage, its line like a wound across the glass. These objects are small, silent rebellions against marble perfection. They are not beautiful. They are real. And I wonder, what is it that survives us? Is it the body, which rots, the image, which lies, or the whisper, faint but stubborn, carried by those who remember? She asked for beauty. She received eternity. But it was eternity carved in stone, not in flesh. Perhaps this is the fate of queens, to be remembered forever, but never as themselves, to be worshipped as goddesses, while their humanity rots unseen. to be eternal only in mass. And yet, I hold her truth still. I remember the weight of her wig in my hands, the sour smell beneath the perfume, the sound of her cough in the silence of night. I remember the way her hands trembled as she reached for broth, the way she closed her eyes at its warmth, as though for a moment she tasted freedom. I remember the cracked mirror, the fear in her eyes as she whispered, "Do not let them see." The world may choose marble, the poets may choose myth, the tourists may choose beauty, but I choose her, the woman, fragile, broken, enduring, the woman who wept, who envied peasant women in rivers, who begged to be remembered not as she was but as she wished to be. And I ask myself, even now, which is kinder, to remember her truth, raw and cruel, or to honor her request and keep the illusion? Perhaps both are cruel, perhaps both are kind, perhaps that is the riddle of memory itself. But one thing I know, she has not been forgotten. Naturally, for in the silence of the palace, in the dust of archives, in the hearts of those who still listen, her whisper endures, not marble, not mask, but whisper, and perhaps that is immortality after all. The years have thinned me. My hands tremble as I write, my eyes blur when I look upon the page. Yet still I hold the quill, for her story demands it. Too many voices have spoken in her name, too many masks have been painted upon her face, and I fear that soon the woman will vanish entirely, leaving only the marble smile. I remember her, not as the statues show, not as the poets sing, but as the woman who walked with slow steps through the corridors, her breath heavy, her eyes shadowed, her hands trembling beneath lace gloves. I remember the smell of roses masking sweat, of incense choking the chapel, of wine sour with fear. I remember her silence at dawn, when she stared from her window at the fields beyond the city, where peasants bathed in rivers and breathed the free air. The world does not want this memory. It wants beauty, perfection, divinity. It wants the illusion she herself begged for. Tell them I was beautiful, and so they obeyed. They built her into marble, painted her into perfection, sang her into eternity. But what is eternity if it is not truth? In my dreams, I walk again through the palace. I pass the cracked mirror, covered in dust, yet still reflecting a pale line of fracture. I hear the faint cough echoing down the corridor, the scrape of shoes on stone, the whisper of skirts heavy with velvet. I feel the weight of the crown that bent her neck, the heat of the fire that burned incense until the air itself seemed to suffocate. Sometimes I think the palace itself breathes with her memory. The stones are damp not only with time, but with her tears. The wood creaks with her groans. The glass remembers her face, pressed close in despair. Perhaps nothing truly vanishes. Perhaps every sorrow leaves an imprint that time cannot wash away. And yet, the people do not see this. They come in crowds, marveling at chandeliers and jewels, snapping photographs before portraits that were lies even when painted. They leave carrying a story of beauty, of glory, of majesty. They do not hear the whisper, but I do, and I know that somewhere, someone else will hear it too. Perhaps a scholar hunched over faded ink, perhaps a child listening to an old grandmother by the fire. Perhaps a tourist who lingers too long in the chapel and feels the air thicken. Hears the faint murmur in the stone. The queen has been dead for centuries. Her body is dust, her bones forgotten. But her voice, her plea, endures. Tell them I was beautiful. I will tell it. I will write it. But I will also tell the rest that she was human, fragile, aching, trembling, enduring. That her beauty was not marble, but flesh, flawed, wounded, alive. And when I lay down my pen for the last time, I will know that I have done what no statue, no poem, no song has done. I have remembered her, not as they wanted her to be, not as she wished to be, but as she was. And that, perhaps, is the only immortality worth having. And so the queen's story, whelmed with shadows and silk, closes. She was born of flesh, lived in illusion, and died in whispers. The world has chosen to remember her as marble, as beauty untouched, as a legend beyond reach. Yet beneath the marble lies the woman fragile, trembling, aching, whose voice still lingers through centuries. Tell them I was beautiful. We told it, we still tell it, but in the end, beauty fades, crowns rust, palaces turn to dust. What endures is not perfection, but memory the flawed, human memory that carries truth like a hidden ember. Perhaps that is the lesson. Her shadow leaves us, that power blinds, that beauty deceives, that even the most gilded crown cannot silence the smallest whisper of humanity. And so we close the pages, letting her rest at last, not as goddess, not as statue, but as a woman remembered, forgotten, immortal in her imperfection. Good night, dear listener. Sleep gently, and carry with you the faint whisper of a queen who lived, who suffered, who was loved, and who was never truly known.